Recording. And make sure the stream is up. And there we go. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahana Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Good. Welcome back. And welcome also to the many who are watching our Satsang online. We're a few minutes running late today. I'm sorry for that. We have a lot of great questions as always, and we'll alternate between questions that come from online and questions that come from our local students here. And there are more questions than we can answer, so I apologize in advance if we don't get to your question. First question is from Radhika, who lives in Tiruvananthapuram. I'm getting better. All right. And Radhika asks, I like this, listen carefully. When Ishvara is equally present in all places, why do we feel Ishvara's presence more in some places? Like in wonderful temples, or in a deep forest, or in the mountains. Why are temples not even equal in the feeling that can arise? In some temples you feel Ishvara's presence more, in other temples you feel Ishvara's less. Is it purely a psychological feeling because we are yet to be enlightened? Radhika answered her own question. Nicely, you answered your own question. And you in fact, the whole thing, nicely done. You correctly said, Radhika correctly said, that Ishvara is identically present everywhere all the time, but we are unable to recognize that presence. To help us recognize Ishvara's presence, we like to build temples. Wonderful. Let us build more, because in each of those temples we have an opportunity to sense Ishvara's presence more deeply. After one becomes enlightened, then, as Radhika says, you can recognize Ishvara anywhere. So, by the way, does that mean that enlightened people will never go to a temple because they see Ishvara everywhere? Why should an enlightened person who's been going to a temple their whole life prior to enlightenment, now that they become enlightened, do they get allergic to going to temples? That doesn't make any sense at all. We can say that the need goes away, but why should the lovely habit shouldn't go away and wouldn't go away? So Radhika very nicely answers her own question. And is it purely a psychological feeling? And the architecture of temples is such that it's meant to evoke or invoke a feeling inside of us. You know, there's a lot, just a few words about temple architecture. You know, and the most traditional temples are found in South India, where Radhika lives, and very often their temples are enclosed by one or more rings of wall. Each set of walls has gates in it. So if you approach a really traditional temple, you go through the outer gate, then you go through an inner gate, and there may be more gates, and then you climb up some steps, and finally you enter the temple, and perhaps it's a little bit darker inside. But then you have to keep going because you go through the first, you're usually in a big hall, Mahamandapam, they'll call it. So you have to go through the Mahamandapam, and then you go from, sometimes there's another one, an Antaramandapam, a middle hall. And then finally, when you're way inside the temple, you reach the Garbhagriha, the sacred chamber where the Lord's form is found. That temple architecture is very deliberately designed in two ways. One is it represents Atma Vichara, outer gate. You've got two gates here, two more gates here, gate here, gate here. So you go in through the outer gate, in through the inner gate, in deeper and deeper and darker. So the whole process of entering a temple represents that process of finding that divinity within you. In the innermost chamber of the temple, you find Ishvara's form. In the innermost chamber of your being, the so-called heart, we find that inner divinity. But to return to Radhika's question, that temple architecture also has a psychological impact. She asks, why do some temples have more of a special feeling than others? So part of it comes from that temple architecture, and when it's done very nicely, it evokes a very strong feeling. Okay, then Sajat, who lives in Dubai. And Sajat asks, can you please explain the concept of upadhi? Upadhi that differentiate ordinary human beings and the God of the cosmos. Upadhi is used in Advaita Vedanta in a highly technical way. And I'd like to answer Sajat's question without going to all that, it's real technical. So let's avoid that. And instead, do the simple version using our famous Vedantic pot. So, this is a pretty small pot. Imagine, so this, and of course, and for a Vedantin would start arguing with me already. What pot? There's only clay. Correct! Yeah, this is Advaita Vedanta, that's our perspective. So there is no pot, there's only clay. So there is clay in the form of a small pot. Suppose you had clay in the form of the cosmos. And just playing with this. This is clay with a very limited form. Suppose you had clay with the most vast and powerful form you could possibly, in fact, you couldn't imagine. Clay whose form was more vast and more powerful than you could imagine. So, notice they're both forms of clay. So the form here is an English word for upadhi. Upadhi doesn't mean form, it's much more technical than that. But here, simply put, we can say that the same clay in the form of a limited pot, it's the same clay with the limitless, actually we have to set the metaphor aside, the same atma, which is enwrapped in a human upadhi, is the same atma that has the upadhi of Ishvara, creator, sustainer, destroyer, karma pala datta, all of that. Same atma, different forms, a limited form and a vast form. So you and Ishvara differ in form, but not substance, to use the words of philosophy. You are different in form, you are not different in nature. Your inner nature is pure consciousness. The nature of Ishvara is the same pure consciousness. But pure consciousness with this limited form can only do limited things. That same consciousness with the limitless form, which is Ishvara's form, is then capable of creation, sustenance, destruction of the universe, and etc. Vijay, who lives in Calicut, in our last class we said nididhyasana. By the way, I'm noticing people have a hard time spelling it because the etymology of the word is not known. Dhyai actually is the root for to meditate. Actually to think, but in this case to meditate. So dhyai becomes dhyana. That's a very common word. Dhyana means meditation. And it takes a desiderative form, dhyai. Sorry, I don't think this is the right place to teach Sanskrit, but I just want you to understand how the word is formed. Dhyai is called a desiderative form, and then you add this prefix ni, which means certainty. N plus di, which is a desiderative form, plus dhya, and then instead of dhyana, dhyasana. So n, very particular, dhya, meditation, and the word is nididhyasana is the word. So every time I get a question about nididhyasana, it's spelled differently. So that's why there's a little aside here. You said that nididhyasana is to be practiced by realized ones, to remain steady in realization. But my understanding is that nididhyasana is a sadhana to be done for the sake of gaining realization. After realization, one doesn't require any practice. Am I wrong? Not wrong, but confused because of this word realization. I didn't use the word realization. So what I said, and I explained this, and I'm going to explain it briefly, but very specifically, the role of Vedantic contemplation, nididhyasana. So first of all, there is a moment when you discover your true nature as Satchidananda Atma. That recognition of your true nature, fancy term is atma, sakshatkara, or simply atma jnanam, self-knowledge. You gain knowledge of your true nature. That recognition is preceded by a long period of preparation. So following a long period of preparation, including listening to the guru, to studying scriptures, other practices, bhakti, meditation, everything, karma yoga, eventually that process of preparation and self-inquiry concludes with recognition of your true nature. That is atma jnanam, that is self-knowledge. I didn't call it realization. Then I called it self-knowledge, which is what it is. But, and in our discussions on nididhyasana, we've observed this many times, and that is, when you discover your true nature, you still have this mind to confront, and your mind is highly habitual. And it turns out that there is habitual identification with the body and mind that continues even after the recognition of your true nature as Satchidananda. And just to make sure that's clear, in neuroscience tells us very clearly that our minds work depending on physiological changes and activities in our brains. That is, the concentration of neurotransmitters and the number of receptors and all the complicated stuff for these receptors, for these neurotransmitters, physically change. So here's the point. If physical change corresponds to a change in thinking. So when you gain this immediate recognition of your true nature as Satchidananda Atma, you gain that in a moment. Is it reasonable to assume that your brain undergoes an instantaneous physiological change? Brains don't work, biology doesn't work like that. So ignorance is removed, absolutely, but we still have biology to deal with. Or to use the language of the ancients, it's a vasana. It's a lingering wrong conclusion, lingering identification with the body and mind. And that lingering identification is removed through a process called nididhyasana. So now watch. We have a process of preparation followed by self-recognition, gaining atma jnanam, followed by another process of removing the problems of the mind, this habitual identification. The moment the problem with Vijay's question is to use this word realization. Which is, tell me, are you realized when you discover your true nature? Or are you realized when your process of removing habitual identification is over? It's arbitrary. Depends on how you define realization, which is why I don't use the word. The moment you use words like realization, then what exactly does it mean? It's not a very clear, specific word. So instead, it would be better to understand that as a result of proper preparation, when you undertake a process of self-inquiry, guided by your guru and the teachings, you discover your true nature. Bang. And that's instantaneous. That's the result of Shravana. Shravana is the result of that process. Then Manana is another process of Vedanta, another practice of Vedanta in which doubts are removed, but we're not talking about that. But the point here is that following that moment of self-recognition, then there's a process of removing this habitual identification. Now we have, just to return to this problem of language, realization is a terrible word. Suppose we use another word which is not much better, enlightenment. When are you enlightened? Are you enlightened when you make that initial discovery? Or are you enlightened when you remove all the obstacles in your mind? And the answer really is neither. Because when you're enlightened, you know that Atma never got into a state of bondage in the first place. There is no such thing as bondage and enlightenment for Atma. This is what Vedanta teaches. So it's pointing to the fact that what we're describing here is a process of spiritual growth, a process of spiritual growth that belongs to an individual person with a body and mind. Atma undergoes no spiritual growth. Atma is eternally liberated, to use the language of Vedanta. Vedanta doesn't liberate Atma. Vedanta first removes ignorance of your true nature as Satchidananda Atma, and then nididhyasana removes habitual identification. When we try to use words like enlightenment or realization, we inadvertently make things more confusing. Let me take one more question here. This is from Venkatesh, who lives in New Jersey. I presume it's not you. we have another Venkatesh who lives in New Jersey, but not this one. There must be a lot of Venkateshas who live in New Jersey. Okay. And he says, I approach life as a series of to-do tasks which have to be acted on, so long to-do list. This approach helps in a sense that it prevents me from wasting my time. After understanding a little bit of Vedanta, I've now added spiritual sadhana tasks to the to-do list along with all the others. So take out the garbage, go to the bank, and practice meditation in that order. However, my list keeps growing as compared to what gets done. So we add to our to-do list faster than we tick them off. And he says, this leaves me feeling unsettled. There's actually a big problem here. Ticking off all those items on your to-do list. First of all, just a bit of a joke. When will you be done ticking off those items? Well, when you die, they're still there. So there's no such thing as ticking off all the items on your to-do list. But suppose you could. Suppose you tick off every item. Then what? Then what? So you said it. Thank you. She said nicely, you get bored. I like that. Nothing to do. How boring. Some people said enlightenment must be so boring. That's not enlightenment. Okay. Not at all. So here's the problem. Sadhana, spiritual practice. If spiritual practice is one amongst many things on your list of things to do, it becomes like a hobby. And I'm sorry to use that word because it's a little bit degrading, but I think it makes a point. And if it's just one of the things you have to do, suppose you like to practice, you like to play music. So you stick into your schedule, play music, practice. So that music, if you're not a professional musician, that music is a hobby. Practicing music is a hobby. And you try to include it in your schedule along with all your other things. In the same way, you try to include some spiritual studies. You try to come to class or try to watch a class online in addition to all your other activities. That sounds good for some, but it's really not so good. Because what it's doing is it's putting spiritual practice at the same level as taking out the garbage. There's just one more thing to be done in a day. And when you reduce spiritual practice to that level, how can that really be fruitful? So, this is where karma yoga walks in the door, so to speak, because here's how this is a funny way of looking at karma yoga, but I think it's effective, especially with this metaphor. Suppose spiritual practice was the number one item on your to-do list. And of course, it's not something you finish in a day or a week or a month, so it stays at the top of your to-do list, day after day, which means every day you see that number one item on your list, and you say, oh, today is meant for spiritual practice. And then if you really understand karma yoga, taking out your garbage is spiritual practice. By the way, if you don't really understand karma yoga, I've said many times, watch that video on my YouTube channel, The Secret of Karma Yoga. You'll discover how taking out your garbage can be spiritual practice, no problem. But the key then is to put spiritual practice in the number one position of your to-do list so that it's in your mind every day, that this day is meant for spiritual practice. So as you're taking out your garbage, as you're going to work, as you're engaged in music or whatever is your hobby, all of that then contributes to your spiritual growth. Nothing wrong with to-do lists, but making spiritual practice one item on that to-do list is the opposite of karma yoga. It should be the number one item. Okay, we'll take some questions here. Okay, we can start here.
So, I mean, I have a few.
Let me turn this on.
Well, I have a ton of questions, but I guess I'll prioritize.
One question, please.
Yeah. All right, so the last question, you know how you said, okay, so you can't have a perfect body, right? So, like, when is a perfect body? So, when can, like, you can't fully ever get rid of false, the habitualization or false identification, like, you fully, right? So then, like, I don't know, like, so what's the point of that?
Oh, okay. You're making a good point about nididhyasana, going back to the prior question. You said that something we've discussed in many satsangs is that the body can't be perfected, and in the same way the mind cannot be perfected. Suppose we say that the goal of spiritual life is the complete and utter eradication of any thought that is in any way contrary to the wisdom of Vedanta, which means the absolute uprooting of all this habitual thinking of the mind. And it's a state of mental perfection. What you just described is not possible. Correct. It's not possible because as a body cannot be perfected, nor can your mind, then the question becomes, well, wait a minute, then how do you gain a state of perfection at all? If nididhyasana cannot make your mind perfect, then what's the point of nididhyasana? The point of nididhyasana is not to make your mind perfect. What can be perfect, this is my guru's words, your mind can never be perfect. The only thing that can be perfect is knowledge. And watch his logic here. 2 + 2 = 4. Is that an approximation? Or is it exact? Hey, that's perfect! 2 + 2 exactly equals 4. Knowledge can be perfect. Suppose your knowledge that I am Satchidananda Atma, utterly unaffected by the mind. That knowledge can be perfect. When that knowledge is perfect, I am utterly unaffected by the mind. Suppose the mind has some problems. Who cares? Suppose the body has some problem. Who cares? It doesn't. Problems need to be dealt with, but they don't affect me. That's the perspective of an enlightened person. So the process of nididhyasana is not intended to culminate in a perfect mind. There is no such thing. But what can be perfect is your understanding that my true nature as Satchidananda Atma is utterly unaffected by the problems of my body and mind. That knowledge can be perfect. Does that work for you?
Can I just ask one more question?
No, we'll take some other questions. Back here.
Swamiji, thank you. Actually, it's also a follow-up for the previous question about enlightenment.
Thank you.
So it's also a follow-up, the same question.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about the spectrum that you're explaining. And you mentioned...
Spectrum process.
Yeah, process.
So the process of preparation, followed by culminating in self-discovery, followed by another process of removing habitual identification.
Right.
Go ahead.
My question is goes back to enlightenment. So and you didn't quite place it there, and you mentioned Atma. But from my understanding, the mind is enlightened. Atma is always...
Correct.
So the mind in that process, when does it get enlightened?
And I chose deliberately not to answer that question.
I apologize to put you on the
No,
spot.
no. I'm deliberately not answering that because we have a problem with language. We want to label all of this stuff, and what I said, if you remember, is our attempt to use these words as labels leads to less understanding instead of more understanding. And this is the point, and I didn't make that very clear before, so let me make it more clear. Enlightenment is not a Sanskrit word. It's an English word. So when we attempt to use an English word to describe this process, then we use our own definition of enlightenment. So, and how you define enlightenment and how I define enlightenment could be very different. So therefore, what I did is I described that process deliberately not using the word enlightenment because I feel it adds to confusion, doesn't add to clarity. So I said there was a process of preparation which includes a process of self-inquiry, guided by the teachings, guided by the Guru, and those processes culminate in, if we want to use any English word, self-recognition is not too bad. Atma jnanam is better. Atma sakshatkara is even better. The Atma sakshatkara means the immediate recognition of your true self. Now, if I call that enlightenment, if we define enlightenment in that way, it's fine. But the problem is that the way I define enlightenment and the way you define it could be different. So suppose we choose not to use the word enlightenment. And we say it is the immediate recognition of your true nature, but then the mind still has its problems, its habitual identification. So then we do some nididhyasana to gradually reduce it. And by the way, to come back to your question, gradually reduce it would be like an asymptotic curve approaching zero, right? Because you never reach a state of perfection. But you know, in following that curve, at some point there's a little bit left. Who cares about whatever is there at the tail of that curve? It's trivial. It's nothing. So we don't care about it. And now, shall we label that state enlightenment? Is enlightenment when you say, "Who cares?" So is enlightenment when you recognize your true nature as Satchidananda Atma, or is enlightenment when your mind is sufficiently established in these teachings that you no longer worry about the imperfections of the mind? Which one is enlightenment? It would be better not to use the word enlightenment. This is a much more precise way of understanding. At the same time, you know, I use enlightenment. We use that word all the time, but in contexts where we're not making this distinction. When we make this distinction, we have to give up that word, enlightenment. That is, when we go very deeply into these teachings to such a level where we distinguish between self-recognition and having a mind that abides in these teachings. That's a deeper level. Prior to that deeper level, we can use the word enlightenment, no problem. I like that word. But eventually we can't hold on to the words, English words in particular, because I'm not sure sustainable is the right word, but you get the idea. Okay, another question here, please.
Swami, just to follow up on the same topic, is that atma sakshatkara, you said, is followed by nididhyasana. So, and you're going to be teaching us nididhyasana as well. So, for nididhyasana, as you're teaching us, can be for anybody, which means that even though it is not atma sakshatkara, some level of absorption is sufficient to do nididhyasana? Is
Some level of atma
no
sakshatkara.
absorption? Because I don't know atma sakshatkara, I'm saying some level of absorption. I don't know what that level of absorption is.
Okay. That's a good question. Can you practice nididhyasana if you have not yet recognized your true nature as Satchidananda Atma? I think it was in the last satsang that we talked about this. And when I said, how can you meditate or contemplate on something that's not known? And I gave my guru's wonderful example. He used to ask us, can you meditate on Gagabugai? Gagabugai? It's not a Tamil word, even though you spoke Tamil, it's not a Tamil word. Gagabugai is a nonsense word he made up. It means nothing. So the point then is you cannot meditate on something which is not known to you. So technically, not technically, realistically, nididhyasana follows recognition of your own true nature. But now I would add something to that. Many people think that recognition of your true nature mean sparks and lights and all of this goes on and it's some amazing mystical experience. For most people, it's not. I think it's profound, but it's not. It's not this kind of explosion kind of mystical experience. It's a profound sense of recognizing, yes, that's true about me. That's true is not self-recognition. Atma is Satchidananda Atma. Okay. But that is true about me is self-recognition. And that moment of self-recognition, in my view, is very common. Most people get it, and generally we call it an insight. Fine, you can call it an insight. I would prefer to call it a moment in which you get it. I am really I am not this body, I am not this mind, I am this unchanging consciousness, utterly independent of the body and mind. You don't have to be a spiritual genius to get it, and I firmly believe that most or all of you have already gotten it. I'm serious. I mean, you are, the fact that you're here today, those of you who are physically present and those of you who are watching online, this kind of teaching is not exactly popular, right? So the fact that you are here shows that you recognize something unusual in these teachings, something of great value, and you've probably been exposed to these teachings sufficiently for you to have made that recognition. That's why I'm saying, I mean it. I think most or all of you have already made that recognition. You may not even think of yourself as having made that recognition, because after that recognition, nothing really changes. Why? Biology. It's not that your mind suddenly changes. Your mind won't change for the reasons we just went through. So you make that recognition, and then you find yourself, I'm still this. But and that's why most people would call it an insight. Because an insight is something that we say it's a moment of knowledge, but it doesn't abide. So then we could say that nididhyasana is a process, and here's a different definition. The more classical way of describing nididhyasana is the gradual removal of this, what's called dehavasana, this habitual identification with the body and mind. In Sanskrit commentaries, it's almost invariably described in those words. There's an alternate description, and this comes from my guru, and maybe it's elsewhere as well, although I haven't really seen it in any commentaries. An alternate description. Back in the 1960s, you remember these Polaroid cameras? You go click, and then zzz, and then the film comes out. So my guru liked to use this as a metaphor. He said, when you click the shutter, the image is taken. But what do you see on that film? It's perfectly white. You don't see anything. Does it mean the image wasn't taken? The image was taken, you just don't see it. You see what I'm suggesting is that your first moment of recognition, because it doesn't lead to a radical change in the way your mind works, you may not even realize that the shutter clicked, that the mind clicked. Over a period of time, though, you know this, in a couple of minutes, that white film gradually reveals its image. So, in this would then be the result of nididhyasana. So what comes as a click, you can see the limitations of the metaphor as well. I'll give you a better metaphor in just a moment. But he used this metaphor long ago, 60s, that was the time. So the click is like that moment of recognition, but nothing much changes. And then through a process of nididhyasana, there is significant change. That picture gets clearer and clearer and clearer. Interesting comparison. When is that picture perfectly done? It's chemistry, like biology, and there's not exactly a start and stop. Chemical reactions just kind of continue. So it's not that there's a start. There is a start because of the film is exposed, but there's no really stopping point for that. In that way, it's a good metaphor for nididhyasana. Now, there is one other metaphor, and then I think we'll leave this topic aside. There is one other metaphor that comes actually in scriptures, less so than the description of the gradual removal of habitual identification. The other way it's been described is a process of assimilation. Now, assimilation means to have this Vedantic world view dominate your thinking. Right now you're thinking mostly worldly, except when you come here on Sunday mornings. But most of the time, your worldview is a normal, mechanical, materialistic worldview. A Vedantic worldview, however, is that all of this is nama-rupa. I am Satchidananda Atma, and whatever is happening out there doesn't really affect me. So I remain full and complete no matter what's happening out here in this realm of name and form. That's a Vedantic worldview. Suppose that worldview was dominant in your thinking. So that you're driving down the road, and instead of being focused on the road, actually you're probably thinking about what you have to do when you get to your destination. No one thinks about driving. But instead of thinking about worldly things, suppose you have this worldview suggests not necessarily active thinking, but rather your basic assumptions. So suppose your assumption was no matter what happens, I'm okay, Meaning, if somebody slams into your car, I'm okay, which is the truth. Your car won't be okay, your body may not be okay, but you, as Satchidananda Atma, you're okay. Suppose that becomes your dominant world view. And that's not impossible through a gradual process of assimilation. Gradual process of assimilation means to be immersed in these teachings again and again, day after day, year after year, as long as it takes, until these teachings are so completely assimilated that it becomes your dominant world view. And the metaphor, I think most of you will like this metaphor. A common example that is given is this famous Indian sweet, rasagula. Gula means this ball of cheese, basically. And this cheese ball is immersed in a sugar syrup so that the syrup enters the ball, and the ball absorbs all the sugar. But notice, to have rasagula, if you take that gula and just dip it in and take it out, not rasagula. It's still a cheese ball. You have to leave it in that syrup for a long time, at least overnight, before it's really absorbed a lot. That's a very common metaphor given to describe this process of assimilation. It takes time for it to go in. And that process of assimilation, more than anything else, is supported by nididhyasana. Not only nididhyasana, just what we're doing in our classes also supports that process of nididhyasana. So anyway, let's take a few more questions here. Next question from Kunal. Kunal lives in Florida. He used to live nearby. And Kunal writes, what is the difference between pure consciousness and nirguna Brahman? What is the difference? Well, according to the Rig Veda, prajnanam Brahma is the Mahavakya that comes from the Rig Veda. Prajnanam means pure consciousness. Brahma means nirguna Brahman. So that Mahavakya means there is no difference whatsoever between nirguna Brahman and pure consciousness. If you ask, how can that be? Good. You should ask, how can that be? Because that question will lead you to go deeply into these teachings of Vedanta. Let me just make an observation. The worst thing you can do, and I'm being a little sarcastic, I guess. The worst thing you can do is say prajnanam Brahma means pure consciousness is identical to nirguna Brahman, and you nod your head, yes, I know that. That's a disaster. It's a disaster. Why? Do you know it, or do you believe it? You wouldn't use the word believe, you'd use the word I accept. What does accept mean? Believe. You don't personally know that to be a truth. Pure consciousness is the consciousness present in your experience right now. Do you know that the consciousness present in your experience right now is identical to nirguna Brahman? That's a little different question, isn't it? But that's what we're talking about. So when you just say, by nod your head here or there, whichever way you nod your head, it's a problem. So instead of accepting it, you should say, it's better, not you should. It's far better to say, how can that be so? How can the ordinary consciousness present in my experience right now be identical to nirguna Brahman? That is the question that leads you in the right direction. To merely accept it, actually, here's a problem with acceptance. Once you accept it, you don't make further effort. Okay, I got that. What else? That doesn't work. Okay, a few more questions. Sushma from Mumbai asks, you've explained how ahimsa paramo dharmaha is our main principle of ethics in Hinduism. In the Anushasana Parva of Mahabharata, Bhishma taught Yudhishthira that killing an animal in certain exceptional circumstances by a kshatriya, like for the sake of self-defense, protection, or food, or when it's offered in a sacrificial fire, is not against dharma. Correct. So ahimsa paramo dharma means don't kill. Killing an animal is killing, but this passage that she is referring to in Mahabharata says that if it is killing in self-defense, killing an animal in self-defense, protection, or for food, or to offer in a sacrificial fire, by the way, after the sacrifice, then it became food, prasad. But now her question. So then, how was hunting for sport, which was done by saintly kings and kshatriyas in ancient times, how could that be accepted or justified as dharma? Hunting for sport. Hunting for sport, properly understood, was done, of course, in ancient times, but hunting for sport means you kill the animal, and then suppose a king is out with his retinue, and they're shooting arrows, and they kill a deer. After killing the deer, do they just leave it there? That's hunting for sport. The deer is dead. Hunting is over. No. They take the animal, bring it back, clean it, and give the meat to people who need it for food. That's what they did. This is at the time of the Mahabharata, kings and others did indeed hunt for sport, but it didn't mean they just let the animals die. They took the animals, and the animals then became food, especially for others who need it. This is, by the way, just to show the arbitrariness of this. Yes, Hindus prefer to be vegetarian because it is an expression of this basic principle, ahimsa paramo dharma, which means you should live without causing harm. But now tell me, animals are living things. What about carrots? They're living things. A carrot is a living thing. You go out to your garden, you grab the carrot by its hair, yank it out of the ground, and then you scrape off all of its skin. You're torturing that poor, and then chop it up, and then put it in boiling water. This is some kind of medieval torture. That poor carrot. It's a living thing. Now, I'm not saying that the value of a carrot's life is the same as the value of a dog's life. Not only that, animals will certainly suffer much more pain than a carrot. Yet, it would be wrong to say that a carrot is an utterly insentient being, because you've all seen these ferns. You touch the fern with your finger, and the fern closes up. Is that an insentient being? That's a fern. If a fern can respond to your touch like that, then what about that poor carrot that you just tortured? You get my point. So, the principle of ahimsa paramo dharma, and we've talked about this before, it's not no himsa, it's minimum himsa, to cause as little harm as possible. And the principle, it's now become so easy. Can you live without eating animals? Yes. Can you live without eating plants? No. And that's our answer. Now, please notice, though, in ancient times, many more people ate meat. And one reason for that, and there might be several reasons, an anthropologist would tell you that 10,000 years ago, when we were still hunters and gatherers, hunting was prevalent, and in fact, an anthropologist will tell you that human beings evolved with such great brains because they ate meat. This is actually mainstream anthropological science. They have determined through a lot of research that our large, powerful brains are the result of the fact that we ate meat. Notice the great apes were primates, right? Are other primates as smart as human beings? No. Why? Because they're omnivores. They eat mostly vegetables, maybe some, bugs and critters and things, but they don't eat meat the way human beings did. So one could even argue that in those days, humans had to eat meat, otherwise they could not survive. By the way, surviving an ice age? How would you survive an ice age? By eating vegetables? Got it? So, meat eating was absolutely prevalent in pre-civilization times, prior to 10,000 BCE, and even after that time, and including ancient India, meat eating was quite common. Actually, there's evidence of something happening about 500 BCE. This is a time when Buddhism and Jainism arose. And there was suddenly a big emphasis on ahimsa. Prior to 500 BCE, ahimsa was there, but it was less emphasized. So something happened in culture back in those days, about 2,500 years ago, where suddenly there was more emphasis on ahimsa, and that's when meat eating gradually went away. Not entirely. Okay, a few more questions. This question is, this is from Concha, who lives in Spain. Concha also is kind enough to translate many of our, for videos, she translates the subtitles for those videos. And her question comes from my classes on Introduction to Advaita Vedanta, when we're talking about the three states of experience, waking, dream, and dreamless sleep. And in that discussion, we discussed how even in deep sleep, consciousness remains. And we describe consciousness as using a term from the Upanishad called alupta-drik. Some of you have heard me use that term before. Drik means seer or witness. The seer or witness which is alupta, unceasing, uninterrupted. The constant seer, the unblinking witness. That's a really nice translation. Alupta-drik, unblinking witness. And she said that when I taught the class, I made reference to my guru teaching the same term, alupta-drik, unblinking witness. That means your consciousness observes every little thing, not observes, reveals every little thing that happens in your mind while you're awake, revealed by this unblinking witness. Whatever happens during a dream, revealed by this unblinking witness. And in deep sleep, the absence of activity is revealed by that unblinking witness. And the metaphor, you've heard me give the example of standing in a dark closet with your eyes wide open. You see, but there's nothing to be seen. The experience of deep sleep is like that. So in explaining this term alupta-drik, unblinking witness, my guru made up a mudra. And mudra means a hand symbol, like this one, this one, this one, this one. These are American mudras. How's this one? And this one, American mudra. Anyway, when you watch Indian dance, it's Bharatanatyam. Lots of nice mudras they use. So he made up this alupta-drik mudra. I made reference to it in class, but Kancha, unfortunately, this class wasn't video recorded, so she's listening to the to the audio recording. She got left out, and maybe others also have gotten left out. So and she asked, can you show me what was Swami Dayananda's alupta-drik mudra? And I still remember it so vividly to this day. And by the way, he does things like this to really burn it into your brain. Sure got burned into my brain. This is in the 1990s. It's still burnt into my brain. And the reason I'm going to show it to you is so it gets burnt into your brain that consciousness never blinks, even in deep sleep. That's the alupta-drik, and his mudra was this. This is Pujya Swami Dayananda's alupta-drik mudra. That's fun. Let's take just one more question, and we'll wrap it up. Oh, let's take this one. This is a question from Amit. I think he lives in India. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Looking at the current state of affairs of Hindus in Bangladesh, where they are now subject to, with the fall of the prior government, there's more discrimination against Hindus in Bangladesh. Also, in another state, look at his language, in another state with minorities, that's our arch-rival neighboring country. Obviously of reference to Pakistan. Okay, so in Bangladesh and in Pakistan, Hindus, who are a minority in those countries, are absolutely subject to significant discrimination and even legalized discrimination, which is really unfortunate. So he says, given that fact, is it not important for Hindus to reconsider their liberal, secular, and laid-back approach to such issues and other religions' nefarious game plans? And he goes on with this. What he's doing, what Amit is doing, is looking at this problem through a political lens. So in India today, there is a distinction made between left-leaning Hindus who are more accepting of other religions and other situations, and then there are the so-called right-leaning Hindus who are more adamant about protecting Hindus and protecting the term that they're using right now, Hindutva. So the right-leaning Hindus. And in my opinion, it's problematic when we look at discrimination against Hindus. Let me change my language here. If we look at this problem of discrimination through the lens of politics, as I think Amit is doing, then we plunge ourselves into politics, which is a mess. It's a mess in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in India, and even more of a mess I think, in this country. Wherever you go, politics is a mess. Now, are there political solutions to these problems? Don't ask me. I'm not a politician. And politicians will go on arguing about solving these problems as long as not as long as problems exist, as long as politicians exist. So, what I would suggest to Amit and to all of us is, instead of looking at these problems through the lens of politics, why don't we look at it from the lens of dharma? Dharma is not politics. So we just talked about ahimsa paramo dharma. So that means discrimination is certainly harmful. So based on that, Hindus in Bangladesh and Pakistan and elsewhere should definitely be protected from harm. Further, dharmo rakshitaha rakshati. When dharma is protected, it protects. Which means dharma itself must be protected so that we in turn are protected by that dharma. Please note then that the principle of dharma supports the protection of Hindus who are subject to discrimination and other problems wherever they are, but in a non-political way. Because as soon as we start using terms like liberal, secular, laid-back Hindus, this is already derogatory language. And the moment you use derogatory language to talk about other people, you're fighting. What happened to ahimsa? This kind of language is a violation of the principle of ahimsa. Why should we? But it's inevitable. As soon as we have left and right, as soon as we have liberal and conservative, as soon as we have Democrat and Republican, or BJP in Congress, or whoever it is, or whatever it is, the moment we get this divisiveness leads to fights. And I'm not talking about sometimes physical fights. In fact, in Bangladesh, there are actually protests and people getting beaten and tear gassed and all of that. But even among people, we fight verbally. And especially in the modern times, things have gotten so divisive that people are just verbally fighting with each other all the time. This is a violation of the principle of ahimsa, but it is inevitable as soon as you look at things through a political lens, and you have left-leaning and right-leaning Hindus, you have liberal and conservative Hindus, as soon as you make that division, you've made a mistake. So I would humbly suggest, that instead of looking at these problems through the lens of politics, which is highly divisive, instead we can look at it through the lens of dharma. And again, the two statements I said, that ahimsa paramo dharma means Hindus should be protected. But to protect Hindus, what is it? Should India invade Bangladesh? Should India invade Bangladesh, like they once did many years ago, during the 70s, I think? Should India invade Bangladesh again to protect the Hindus? Well, you get it. That's more ahimsa. So that's not a solution. So to handle himsa through more himsa is obviously a mistake. So that's why I'm suggesting, instead of looking at these through the lens of politics, from the perspective of dharma, from the perspective of ahimsa, if we act responsibly to minimize the harm done to everyone in all situations, then you can address problems without causing divisiveness. By the way, is there anyone, a final comment. In this country, actually other countries as well, the common expression uses hawks and doves. This is with regard to a war. There are those who are hawkish, and they're all for war. So the hawkish, let's just imagine some hawkish Hindus wanting to force Bangladesh politically or even through armed forces to force Bangladesh to change their policies. And then you have the doves, what Amit calls the liberals, who are secular and laid back. And those are very typical Indian chalta hai. Kya karenge? Aisa ho gaya, koi baat nahi. This kind of this kind of language. Laid back. Wouldn't you say both of these extremes are unhealthy? The position of being the hawk is unhealthy. The position of being the dove is unhealthy. These are political sides. And this is where we make this mistake, and this divisiveness. So instead of being hawk or dove, instead of being right-leaning or left-leaning, instead of being conservative or liberal, why not be dharmic? That's all that's required. Just be dharmic. Okay, it's a good place to conclude. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinaha sarve santu niramayaha sarve bhadrani pashyantu ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet asato ma sadgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityorma amritangamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Om Tat Sat. See you next time.